Hello everyone, and this is part 3 of the videos on Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, and this is the part called Children. And this is where he's answering his third question, which is what, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? And he's like, look, fairy tales are always associated with children, and let's talk about why that is. He talks about how people say things like, this book is for children from the ages of 6 to 60. And he's like, why don't we advertise cars like that? Because that seems to make more sense. But really, these questions here are kind of critical for his purpose in this whole section. He says, is there any essential connection between children and fairy stories? And he's going to say, no. And then, is there any call for comment if an adult reads them for himself, reads them as tales, not studies them like curios, right? He's like, adults are allowed to study anything, whatever it is. But once you get an adult who reads fairy tales, everybody starts asking questions. This is exactly what has happened to Tolkien in his life. So this is him defending what he's interested in because other people think he's weird. And he's like, all right, first of all, the fact that we have fairy tales associated with children, he says it's an error. We think that kids are different, that they're not human beings. We think of children as some sort of strange, separate animal. And he says, I think this might be because they don't have kids and or they're not around kids very often. So they don't realize the kids are just like humans because they are humans. Tolkien had 4 kids, so he's speaking from experience here. And he says the fact that we associate children with fairy stories is an accident of domestic history. Here's the thing, Tolkien's British, and he's being so British right now. An American in the same time period would probably say similar things. He's going to go on about how these kinds of stories get relegated to the nursery, and the nursery is like the attic, and then you just throw all the other stuff up in the attic, and nursery stories, fairy tales, just kind of ended up going up there along with it. One of the things he doesn't get into here, because this is something his audience would already have known, during Tolkien's life and probably the 100 years before, specifically Americans and English upper class people would hire nursemaids to take care of their kids, and the general stereotype was that German nursemaids were better than anybody else in the world. So a lot of upper class British families and Americans too would hire German nursemaids to take care of their kids. So those German nursemaids came over and they brought all the German stories that they knew with them, which is why a lot of our fairy tales have Germanic roots. That's why they're all like dark forests and elves. You know, we don't get a whole lot of Aladdin. Those stories, you know, from the Middle East, they don't show up in our fairy stories for a very long time. Even by the time Tolkien's talking, they're not really in the same category. Arabian Nights and fairy tales would be in separate books. They wouldn't be together because we have all these Germanic stories that made it in there. So that stereotype of like, you want a good English woman to watch your children, or a good German woman to watch your English children. There it is partly responsible for this. But he also says it's just because we throw everything in the attic when we think we don't need it anymore. It's not like children stood up and said, you know what stories we like? Fairy tales. Children had nothing to do with this. The adults in the room decided that these were stories that were good for children. And he's like, this is pretty much accidental. There's nothing in a fairy story that innately appeals to children. And he says, you know, especially lately when fairy stories have been written or adapted for children, Tolkien had strong feelings about Disney. We're not going to talk about that now. But fairy stories that were, he says they were banished, right? The same way that you take a table, it's a beautiful table, you put it in a schoolroom and you don't take care of it and you let kids run rampant and color and paint, that story's going to get ruined. That table is going to get ruined. So he says that's what happened. He talks a little bit about Andrew Lang, and he loves, as you've seen in the previous parts, he loves Andrew Lang and he loves those fairy books, that series. But he does say, look, they're better. They're not just like a lumber room where like there's crap everywhere. It's more like a rummage sale, right? That someone has gone through and they've picked out the good stuff and they've presented it that way. But he does have, you know, a lot of attitudes that bleed over into the way that he's presenting these stories to children. He says, you know, they're for children to whom and for whom they're told. They say they represent the young age of man true to his early loves and have his unblunted edge of belief, a fresh appetite for marvels. Is it true, he says, is the great question that children will ask. And he's like, yeah, that's true. Children do. They always ask about whether it's true. And but belief and appetite for marvels, he kind of throws those together, and Tolkien's like, those are very different. That if you have a belief that a thing can happen or could, like, it exists in the real world, versus the idea of children who don't have the experience, so they can't tell if something is real in the larger scheme of things. It's not that they're dumb, they just don't have the frame of reference to know. And then he makes this comment about literary belief. He's like, all right, here's the thing. If you are in a good story and the story maker's art is good enough, then you will believe it. You won't have to indulge in what we call the willing suspension of disbelief. You've probably heard this phrase before in an English class, right? The idea is when you open up a Harry Potter or something that's not history, a fiction story, you have disbelief because you know that it's one, not possible, or two, didn't happen, and you willingly suspend that disbelief in order to enjoy the story. And he's like, that's not enough. If you are willingly suspending your disbelief, he says that the art has failed. A true successful sub-creator has made a secondary world in which your mind can enter and you believe it while you're there. You're not like, I'm aware that I'm reading Harry Potter and I know that people can't fly on broomsticks. You're like, while you're reading it, you're in it. You're imagining yourself there. And the moment that you fall out of the story and you have to suspend your disbelief, he says the art or the magic has failed. That it's a subterfuge, it's a fake. It's what we tell ourselves in order to get through a story rather than appreciating like a great work of art. And then he compares this to cricket. He's like, look, someone who loves cricket is like there. They are in it. But he says, me, when I watch a game, I pretend to be there. I can pretend enough to enjoy it, but I don't love it the way that some people love it. They really get into it. Me, not so much. He makes this comment about, I have a preference for dark blue rather than light with the color of their shirts. But he says, look, if you really like it, if you fall into the art and the art is well done, then you wouldn't have to suspend your disbelief. You would believe in whatever the story is. And he talks a little bit more about children, right? If they don't like it, they can't really express why they don't like it because they don't have the vocabulary yet. They will later on, and they don't really have a pattern for like what they like or don't like. Kids will just be like, I like this thing. Why? Because I do. And he says that's fine. Later on, they will discern why. Then he talks about this idea of, is it true? And he's like, really what a kid is asking is, what kind of a story are you telling me? Like, should I believe this or not? And then he's a little critical of his fellow humans here. He says, look, we all know the differences in kind, but we're not sure how to place what we hear. A child may well believe a report that there are ogres in the next county. Many grown-up persons find it easy to believe that of another country. As far as for another planet, very few adults seem to be able to imagine it as people to fall, but monsters. So he's like, don't trash children because they think that monsters are real. Some of his fellow Englishmen may look at people from another country that they've never been to and be like, those people are all horrible. So he says, we all do it. This is a human thing. And then this is where he's a little critical of Andrew Lang here, because he says, children's taste remains like the taste of their naked ancestors thousands of years ago. They like fairy tales better than history, poetry, geography, arithmetic. And he's like, well, first of all, they're not naked. And it's just in the way that you present it. He's like, there are good poetry books, though Tolkien admits he does not like poetry. He didn't like it until he was much older. He used to skip it when he was a kid. But he says there are good introductions to history and geography and arithmetic. If it's well done, then kids will respond to it, and the same thing's true for a fairy tale. The idea being fairy tales are well done. That's what he's getting at. He talks a little bit about himself, right? He says, look, when I was a kid, I had no special wish to believe. I wanted to know. I wanted to know if it was real or not. And he says, now look, fairy tales weren't concerned with possibility, but with desirability, the things that I wanted. And he's like, look, I read Alice, Treasure Island, not really. The Indians were cool, bows and arrows, I'm excited, but not really. Languages, yay. But Merlin and Arthur were better. And best of all, Sigurd, right? He loves Sigurd of the Volsungs and the Prince of all Dragons. He was like, dragons are awesome. I don't want one in my neighborhood, but they're awesome to read about. And that's what attracted him to the idea in fairy stories was dragons primarily. And then he says, but in general, as a kid, I didn't particularly love fairy stories more than anything else. He's like, look, I almost wrote that my childhood was happy or golden time, but it wasn't. We'll talk about Tolkien's life and his biography, but yeah, I think it's funny where he's like, my childhood wasn't great, thanks. And then he says here, you know, I hated poetry, I skipped it. And then later on, I was like, all right, poetry's awesome. But he says basically what I've been saying this whole time is that fairy stories should not be especially associated with children. There's more to it than that. Now, he talks a little bit about the difference between childhood innocence and adulthood, and he's like, don't make the mistake of childhood equaling innocence and adulthood meaning wickedness, that those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and those are silly categories. He doesn't enjoy them. Yeah, he gives it the Eloy and the Morlocks from the Time Machine comparison. He's like, look, you can't call people or put people in these categories so simply. There's more nuance than that. And then he says, all right, look, if you are writing a good fairy story, fairy tale, a good story, then it will be artistic, it will be literary, and then he says it will do the things that all other literature does, and then he lays out some terms that are brand new. He says it will help you with fantasy, recovery, escape, and consolation, and that's what he's going to talk about in the next section.